Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Vanishing Hour. I've been dragging ass a little here, and I wanted to have this episode out a little sooner, but it is here regardless, and it's one that matters to me. But that's not really fair to say because all of the cases that I cover matter a lot to me. But this one has a heightened sense of urgency considering it's been over 30 years, 35 to be exact, that this case has been ongoing and unsolved. So let's talk about it. This is the vanishing of Jaye Potter Mintz. Jaye was actually named Beverly, but she was known to most as Jaye and preferred to be addressed as Jaye. She was born in 1963 to William and Lorraine Potter. She also had an older sister by the name of Jill. There wasn't a ton of readily available information on her prior to her horrific death, and it always bums me out when I don't find much because I like talking about who people were, not just what horrible things happened to them. There wasn't any mention of her father, William, or anything about her childhood. What I did find, though, that Jaye was married fairly young, though. She met a man by the name of William Allen Mintz, and she fell in love with him, and in 1983, the two were married. William was an active member in the U.S. Army for the time that they were married. The relationship sadly did not last long, though, and for unspecified reasons, the two separated in 1986. William remained in the Army and was stationed overseas in Germany, while Jaye continued on in Leland, North Carolina, with their two young boys, ages 4 and almost 2, along with her mother, Lorraine, living nearby. Despite the toll that a separation can have on someone, Jaye wasn't allowing that to bog her down. By the end of 1986, Jaye had landed herself a job as a waitress in a nearby larger city of Wilmington and was able to maintain her household. Soon after, her cousin Angela and her daughter moved into the charming home on Dresser Lane. At age 23 and a mother to 2 boys, she definitely had her whole life ahead of her. Jaye was not a loud or extroverted person by any means. She was usually quiet and shy and very reserved. She had no desire for any unwanted attention or to be at the center of any of it as well. Everyone described her as someone who was as sweet as could be. She was polite and courteous and just a gentle-natured person. She was also incredibly gorgeous. She had the signature Farrah Fawcett haircut that was all the rage at that time, but with beautiful brown hair instead of blonde. She had perfect skin and the biggest brown doe eyes I've ever seen. I saw her pictures and I was just instantly envious of how beautiful she was. To have the looks and just be a genuinely nice and humble human being and a loving mother, it really just makes you mad that bad things happen to these types of people. By the time 1987 rolled around, Jaye was turning over a new leaf in her life. She even opened up to the possibility of dating again. Shortly before her death, she had started seeing someone new. As she cautiously re-entered the dating pool, though, she also struggled with the unwanted attention that came with it. Her cousin Angela stated that in the early months of 1987, shortly before her murder, Jaye was getting some disturbing and unwanted activity. 2 different sources stated that a cousin of Jaye's said she started receiving unwanted calls to the house. One cousin stated that the calls would always start after she came home from work, as if the person knew her schedule and knew when she would be home to answer the calls. The other cousin stated that the calls started after an ad Jaye had placed in the local newspaper a month before her death. The ad is important to this case, so we will get into that a little later, but regardless, Jaye was definitely receiving strange, taunting, creepy and pervy calls in the weeks leading up to her death. Sorry, coffee break. The strange activity, though, did not end there. One of the cousins continued to share that Jaye also had an unnamed admirer who would draw out in the gravel in her driveway the words, "I love you, Jaye," which is extremely off-putting and weird. It's not known if this person was someone Jaye knew or a secret admirer that she was unaware of, though. Another account was that there was a man who would come into Jaye's place of work and leave her a single red rose. It was relatively I can't talk this morning. It was relatively clear that these actions were not wanted by Jaye, but she always remained polite about them and gently denied these advances. About a week prior to her death, Angela claims that she was home when she passed by Jaye's room one morning and saw her crying. She asked her what was wrong, and Jaye told her that she had the most terrible nightmare about a strange man killing her. Angela sort of wrote it off initially, but it has haunted her since her cousin's death. Now we are up to the events that transpired on the day that Jaye was murdered. For a little backstory, 1 month before her death in January of 1987, Jaye was looking to sell her queen-size waterbed. She noticed that the local newspaper was running a special for residents where they could take out one free ad for the month. Jaye decided to take advantage of this offer as a way to try to sell this waterbed. Her youngest son, Andrew, was getting ready to turn 2, and I imagine part of the motivation to sell the bed was to have a little extra spending money for the party she wanted to throw for her baby the following month. Let's fast forward now 1 month. It is now February of 1987. Jaye's ad listing for the waterbed had not gotten her any serious inquiries. Mainly all it got her was a bunch of whack job phone calls from the town idiot being a pervert, apparently. But regardless, she was determined to sell the bed. From what I gathered, you needed a phone number in order to place the ad. Since Jaye had already used hers for the initial ad, she decided to take advantage of the still going on offer the newspaper had, but was going to use her mother's home phone number instead. Let's be real, we all would have done the same thing back then. Mind you, this was a time long before Craigslist, Facebook Marketplace, all of that crap. So Jaye places the ad for the waterbed with her mother's phone number. This ad I was actually able to locate online. It's extremely simple and to the point. There is no personal information. It simply states a waterbed for sale. Call this number. It's maybe 1 inch long and 1 inch wide, and it's sandwiched between many other ads. It could easily be missed if you were browsing rather quickly through the newspaper ads. But anyway, we are now up to the day of Jaye's murder, horrifically being the day before her son turns 2. The day is February 23rd, 1987. Lorraine Potter, Jaye's mother, who lived just a few minutes away, receives a call sometime before 9:30 a.m. It's a man who is interested in the waterbed that Jaye is selling. He saw the ad, called the number, and Lorraine is thrilled that they have finally found a buyer. She gives the man directions to the house for him to stop by later and to pick it up from Jaye. As soon as she hangs up with this man, she calls Jaye. When Lorraine tells Jaye about the buyer, Jaye surprises her mother by saying that she has already found someone to buy the bed. One source stated that one of Jaye's friends' mother was interested in the bed and confirmed that interest earlier that morning. Lorraine tells Jaye that she already gave the man directions to the house, so when he arrives, just simply explain to him the mix-up, and she's sure he will understand. Lorraine lets her daughter know that she will be by sometime later to continue to help with the birthday plans for the following day, and then they hang up. This is the last time that Lorraine speaks to her daughter. At this point, Jaye and her youngest son are the only ones home. Angela and her daughter were not home that morning, and Jaye's older 4-year-old son was with another grandparent as well. Sometime around noon, Lorraine decides to stop by Jaye's house. She pulled up to the house and headed to the door when she noticed her first red flag. She knocked. There was no response. And after a moment, she tried the door and realized it was unlocked. That was completely out of character for Jaye, who always had her doors locked. Concerned, Lorraine opened the door and walked in. She was instantly greeted by the sound of baby Andrew crying from a nearby room. She rushed into the room and was horrified. There on the waterbed was the body of her daughter, Jaye. Andrew was there beside her, whimpering, thankfully unscathed. Lorraine, in absolute horror, scooped her grandson up and ran screaming from the home to a nearby florist shop where she begged for the shop owner to call the police. When the police arrived on the scene, they had to take note of several things. For starters, there was no sign of forced entry. There were no broken windows, jimmied locks, pry marks, nothing. So they operated on the notion that Jaye must have let the person in, unless they obviously had a key. Her 1-year-old son was able to communicate that there was a knock at the door sometime between 9:30 and noon, and Jaye had looked into the peephole. When she saw no one, she opened the door and was bum-rushed by a man that her son did not recognize. He simply said, "Mean man hurt mommy. Mommy cry." What a horrible thing to witness and to have to hear from the mouth of a baby. It just made me feel sick when I heard that. The next thing that investigators noted at the scene was the extent of the violence done to Jaye. Her hands were bound behind her back with a nylon rope that the police concluded the killer had brought with him. And when her mother found her, there was a pillowcase over her head. She had been stabbed multiple times, and her throat had been slit so deep that she was almost decapitated. Jaye had also been raped. It's clear that there was a lot of anger and aggression behind this attack. It was definitely emotionally charged for some reason. This is often seen in cases where the attacker knows the victim or feels the victim represents someone that they are angry at. The pillowcase over the face is also commonly seen in cases where the attacker knows the victim and feels some sort of shame for what they did, things like that. The only time a face is really covered in a random attack, more often than not, is to conceal the attacker's identity. But as we know from her son's account, he saw the man's face when he pushed his way into the home and he didn't recognize him. Also, to note, he left the child alive. People who are worried about being identified kill any witnesses, no matter how young, as a way to tie up any potential loose ends. This person left her son alive. This attack wasn't about him, and it wasn't about just targeting a home and killing someone. This was clearly about Jaye. That's what's apparent to me, at least. The last piece of evidence that stood out to the investigators has been a bone of contention for many that have reviewed this case, and it's the cutout and circled ad that Jaye had placed in the newspaper regarding her waterbed. The ad apparently did not come from any newspaper within the home, nor did they believe that this was cut out and circled by Jaye. They believed the killer brought it with them to the scene. For initial investigators, this was just one of the first major leads. So obviously in cases like these, and in most cases of murder, police took to the people closest to the victim who could have reason to kill or know of someone who would want the victim dead. They looked at Jaye's estranged husband first. Reasonable, obviously. Was he against their separation? Was the split amicable? Could he have had the means of committing this crime? These are all valid questions to ask. For me, there's the question of, wouldn't her youngest son have been able to identify the husband if he was the attacker? I do feel that if her husband was the attacker, her son would have recognized him, with it being his father and all. It was also stated that the police cleared him of suspicion when his alibi was verified. He was actively overseas with the army in Germany, to be exact, at the time of her murder. Ultimately, Jaye's estranged husband, William, remarried, one by the name of Linda, and in 1993, at the age of 29, he passed away. His cause of death is listed as carbon monoxide asphyxiation, but there was no further information that I was able to find regarding him or his death. The next person of interest was the new love interest Jaye had just started seeing. The man's name was never revealed, but he was only known to be a local restaurant owner whose alibi had also been checked out and verified. He claimed to be home with a plumber he had called who was doing some work for him at the time of the murder. With the two most obvious suspects eliminated, the police turned to family and friends for any help in identifying who would have done this to Jaye. All of her loved ones repeatedly stated that they couldn't think of a soul in the world that would want to have wished harm on Jaye. She just wasn't a person to make enemies, which made it all the more glaringly obvious that maybe her death had something to do with the ad that she had placed to sell her bed. As we know, Jaye was expecting a stranger to arrive at some point during the day to let them know that the bed was no longer available. It is perfectly reasonable to conclude that, given the circumstances, this might have been the person who attacked her. But I think if you look at it a little more closely, it would make less sense that it was a stranger. For starters, whoever committed this crime chose to attack in broad daylight. Jaye's neighborhood was in no way isolated. There was a flower shop literally next door, a restaurant less than 500 feet down the road, neighbors in relatively close proximity, and there was even a roofing company working on a roof of a home across the street from Jaye's house during the time of her murder. Need to plug in my headset real quick because it keeps beeping. There we go. If this was a random stranger, don't you think they would have been taking a huge gamble in targeting her home? They wouldn't know if she was alone, had a husband, or someone else in the home, or anything like that. I think that it is too big of a risk to take for a random attack. This person had to have known she was alone, knew that there were no obstacles in the way, knew they had a specific window of time to commit this crime, and were able to leave the area without being noticed. It circles back to the phone calls her cousin mentioned she started getting in the weeks prior to her death. They always started after she arrived home. That's indicative of someone knowing her schedule, her pattern, watching her. The manner in which he attacked her is something of interest as well. He knocked and then hid from view of the peephole and then waited for her to open the door and rushed her. If you were a man looking to murder a woman under the guise of buying a waterbed from her and knowing she's expecting you, why take the time to play ding-dong ditch? You knock, you know she's expecting you, and she might even let you in. Keep in mind, the buyer spoke to the mother that morning, who had no idea the bed was already sold. The attacker wouldn't have known he was getting turned down for the bed. He'd expect to be let in. On top of it all, if you were targeting a woman via her waterbed ad, why would you take the time to leave the ad behind after you murdered her? Some investigators suggested that this was his calling card or signature of sorts. But if you take a look at the violent crimes committed in and around the area, there were no females being murdered in their homes and having placed an ad in the newspaper and then having it left at the scene. In fact, this particular crime was out of the ordinary for this area. The only other unsolved murders during this time not only involved men, but were not sexually violent in nature or brutal in this manner either. Police compared this crime to similar crimes in neighboring counties and states, but there were no ties between this crime and those. To me and to other investigators who later combed over this case, the ad left at the crime scene reads more as a red herring. I'll get into that a little more when we discuss theories, though. It isn't known if Loreen was able to catch the caller's name or any identifying information. Police never formally stated that they identified who the potential buyer was. I do feel that if I was the guy who was looking to buy the bed and ended up finding out that the woman was murdered, I would have come forward immediately and identified myself if I had nothing to hide. I'm not saying that the person never did that, but it sounds like to some extent this particular person is still on the investigators' radar even 30 plus years later. So if anyone's keeping track, that would be a point under the column of Mattress Man being the murderer. Sadly, Loreen never forgave herself for giving that caller her daughter's information that fateful morning. The weight of guilt she carried over that, coupled with the fact that she had been the one to discover her daughter with her grandson crying nearby, would be a weight too heavy for anyone to carry. Family and friends said that Loreen was never the same after that day, and no mother would be, and I can't even begin to imagine. Loreen ended up adopting Jaye's 2 boys and raised them herself, but she could never shake the guilt and sadness of the loss of her daughter. In 2007, Loreen and family made a final public plea for any information about Jaye's death. The case was covered by the local sister station of NBC. They ran a cover story that interviewed the investigators on the case at the time and the family as well. Loreen stated that for 7 years after her daughter's murder, she was plagued with nightmares regarding her death. She said that eventually one night she had a dream that Jaye came to her and that it was the best dream. She said she could see her and reach for her, and it felt so real. After that night, she no longer had nightmares. Loreen sadly passed away shortly after the coverage in 2007. She was only 63 years old. Despite being passed between several investigators' hands over the past 35 years, this case, while not considered cold by the investigators' standards, remains unsolved. Every lead that they have obtained has been followed and cleared according to them. DNA evidence was mentioned in initial reports covering the case. However, DNA analysis was barely in its infancy at the time of this murder. In 2014, investigators hoped that new technological advances with DNA analysis would aid in solving Jaye's case. However, there has been no word since. Criminal psychologists have combed over the case and gave their insights as to what they think happened and who would have done this. I've read over the theories of the investigators both on and off of the case, and I have come to my own conclusions as to what possibly could have happened, and I'd want to go over that now. The way I see it is that there is really only one logical scenario here, but I do know that the investigators are working a couple because that is what they're supposed to do. It wouldn't be wise to put their eggs all in one basket if they didn't have the evidence to back that basket up. Scenario 1 is that investigators believe that the man who called Loreen that morning inquiring about the ad for the waterbed could be the person who killed Jaye. From a very basic standpoint, that would make sense. For starters, he was expected to show up at the house sometime that morning. He had directions from Loreen, and maybe it's possible that she divulged to the caller that her daughter would be home alone. Plus, the ad was found at the scene, cut out and circled in red. As far as public knowledge goes, the caller never came forward to police to tell them that they had called that morning, and either never showed up or did, and police were surrounding the place, so they left, etc. So that is also odd. However, I think that's pretty much where that scenario dries up, though, at least with the information that is known to the public. It's possible the police have more and are just not sharing. But for argument's sake, let's just operate under the notion that that is in fact the extent of information. Here's where my problems start. The ad has zero personal information that would indicate a female is selling the bed. To peruse through ads on that page and pick that one as a target for a woman who lives alone seems unlikely. Now, it's possible after speaking with Loreen, the person had their hopes of it being a female selling the bed confirmed. But I doubt a conversation over a bed with a complete stranger led to Loreen sharing that her beautiful, young, attractive, and soon-to-be divorced daughter would be home alone that morning. I could be wrong, obviously, but I'm not going to assume that I am not. My next issue is the manner in which the attack occurred. Her son, who witnessed the entire thing, stated that there was a knock at the door, at which point Jaye looked in the peephole and saw no one. She proceeded to open the door when suddenly the attacker bum-rushed her and made his way into the home. Her son did not recognize the face of the man, which would align with a stranger, but also it could have been someone Jaye was acquainted with via work or other contact and just never had them meet her children. It could have also been one of the town idiots that were leaving her notes in her gravel or calling her house and being scuzzy, or even the alleged person who was leaving flowers at her work. This also could have been all the same person as well. Her son not recognizing the person just means that it wasn't anyone within her close network of friends and family that would have had contact with her children. Now, if I was intending to rape and murder, etc., a stranger who placed an ad for a waterbed, and I went so far as to call the number and get directions to the home, I would naturally think that I could walk up to the door, knock, and be let in to see the bed. It runs a much lower risk of creating a scene or attracting attention. We know that Jaye was intending to tell the person the bed was already sold, but the attacker wouldn't have known that. And based on her son's accounts of the attack, Jaye wasn't ever given the opportunity to tell the person, hey, the bed's sold already, sorry. The next issue I have is the ad being left at the scene. While I know the investigators indicated that while the scene did hint at a certain amount of premeditation, what with the killer bringing their own nylon rope and knife, there wasn't anything that indicated this was done with any sort of precision or skillfulness, as tacky as that sounds. Essentially, that this wasn't an experienced person who attacked and killed her. Investigators stated that the scene indicated that there appeared to be moments where the perpetrator was in control of himself and moments where he was not, and that it was just very chaotic. A psychologist who was later allowed access to the case files looked them over and disagreed with that statement, though. He felt that the perpetrator had been stalking Jaye for a certain amount of time prior to killing her. He says that he believes this because this person knew exactly when to attack without any complications and knew there would be no one else home. I think they both have valid points to be made, and I think that, honestly, it's probably both. I think the perpetrator was in fact stalking her and waiting for the opportune time to strike, but that doesn't mean that he was an expert at killing. Stalking someone already requires a certain level of instability within someone's mind. It's not a far leap to suggest that a stalker would be struggling to maintain their composure when they chose to violently act on their victim. With all of that being said, do you really think that someone this inexperienced with killing has a signature or a calling card? If the ad was left by the killer, it was 100% as a way to deter police. And as far as I can see, it worked. If you were the man that called regarding the bed, targeted her randomly, obviously, and left the ad as your calling card, I can assure you that you wouldn't have left evidence at the scene that indicated you were unhinged and out of control at any point during the attack. Every move up until that point would be considered calculated, so why would you leave evidence behind that showed you were inexperienced and losing control? Also, as horrible as this sounds, a calling card killer probably wouldn't have left her son alive. It's a risk most calculated offenders, random offenders too, if this was indeed a random attack, would not risk. Which brings me to her son as well. I am so happy that he was not physically harmed in this attack, but if this was random, calculated killer type, her son would most likely not be here with us today. He's a witness, a loose end, and a liability in their eyes. Even if he was only 2, for many detached random killers, that isn't enough to justify keeping him alive. Her attack was calculated in the sense of pre-planning, but the attack itself was very personally charged and sloppy. All the aggression and anger was taken out on Jaye. Overkill is the term often used to describe this type of attack, and you see that in almost every attack where the victim knew their attacker on some sort of level, whether personal or just surface level, or the attacker may correlate the victim to someone specifically in their life. The victim may represent someone that affects them strongly and negatively, and they lash out on the victim because of it. My point is, this person was laser focused on Jaye for whatever reason. It errs on the side of personal. I also wanted to note that I found it particularly interesting that the perpetrator was able to enter the neighborhood, rush into her home the way that he did, attack and murder her in a very violent, physical, gruesome, and bloody way, and exit the home and neighborhood without being noticed by anyone in a very short window of time. Either this person was just a chameleon and was invisible to people and blended in and was able to exit the area without anyone noticing, which could be possible. Or I wonder if anyone ever considered the possibility that no one noticed him leave because he never left. We know that Jaye was receiving calls to her home that one source stated would come in suspiciously every time she got home from work. We know that someone was leaving her notes in her driveway gravel that read, "I love you, Jaye." We know the perpetrator knew she would be home alone that morning and wouldn't encounter anyone else within that time frame. Angela was living there with her daughter at that time. The odds that a random attacker timed that up perfectly by chance is very low. This shithead stabbed her multiple times and slit her throat almost to the point of decapitation. I can assure you he was probably covered in blood. Police never made any mention of any sort of cleaning up done at the scene. And again, with such a short window of opportunity, I doubt he hung around to clean himself up or change his clothes. He had to have exited that home covered in blood. Now, in the middle of the morning, broad daylight, with a roofing company working across the street, a flower shop open next door, and a restaurant less than 500 feet away, I would be shocked if he got far without anyone noticing him covered in blood. Is it really such a stretch to consider that maybe this man lived in the neighborhood to begin with? No one has a better opportunity to learn your day-to-day patterns than that of your neighbors who see you come and go from your home. They see when you leave for work. And it doesn't necessarily mean that her kids would have been able to identify him either if he just simply watched from afar. As I considered all of this information, I developed a theory of my own. Keep in mind, this is just my theory that is based on what I've read. There is plenty of information I do not have, and of course, as always, this is pure speculation. But I believe Jaye was murdered by someone who was obsessed with her. I don't necessarily think that this was a person she was very familiar with. At most, someone maybe she waved to or smiled at whenever she rarely interacted with them. I think that the second the person was out of sight, she completely forgot about them. However, he did not. I also think it could be possible that this was someone who approached her at some point and expressed interest, and that she politely shot them down. I think that this person wasn't initially triggered by the shoot down, but continued to stalk her movements and got to quote unquote know her in their mind that way. They left the gravel notes for her, maybe showed up to her place of work to leave flowers. However, I think things maybe began to take a turn when Jaye wasn't reciprocating any of these gestures. That could have been the time the phone calls began to come in. I think the trigger was the new relationship that Jaye began with the restaurant owner. The relationship was very new according to accounts. Someone watching her would have eventually caught sight of her new relationship, and this could have been the trigger. This would have changed the purpose of the stalking from getting to know her to now establishing a window of opportunity to attack. The sexual aspect of this attack feeds this obsessed stalker theory. So does the evidence that the person was unstable in their emotions during the attack. Emotional conflict about hurting her could be a factor. Leaving her child untouched is another sign of that care that they have for her. Being that the ad had no personal information like names or addresses listed on it, if the ad was left by the killer, they'd had to have known it was Jaye's ad. That assumption fits with the caller being the killer, but it would also fit with someone stalking her, knowing she was intending to sell the bed as well. She used her phone number for the first ad. Phone books were a thing at this time. You could easily look someone up in the phone book and have their number. A stalker would most definitely take advantage of that opportunity if they didn't have their victim's number already. I'd also like to mention that I would like the police to consider that the suspect could have been someone in the immediate area, like a neighbor or a business owner. Someone who would blend into the area because they lived there or worked there, and it wouldn't be odd that they were in the area. They wouldn't stand out or be memorable, and they would have access to cleaning up and changing out of their bloody clothes without having to travel far. The last possibility I would like to leave you all with is the possibility that the stranger that called Lorene that morning in regards to the mattress that was... Okay, that was weirded. Worded weird. Let's start over. The last possibility I would like to leave you all with is the possibility that the stranger that called Lorene that morning in regards to the mattress was in fact not a random stranger at all, nor was it someone legitimately interested in purchasing the bed. If I had to place my eggs in any basket, I would say that the caller that morning was the stalker. They called Lorene to plant the seed of a stranger arriving at the house that morning. They then proceeded to leave the cutout ad at the scene, further corroborating the idea that the random stranger buying the mattress killed Jaye. This would explain why the caller never came forward to state that they were the one interested in buying the bed that day. It would also corroborate why Ding Dong Ditch approach never made sense to me if it was the caller wanting to buy the mattress. It would also explain why the ad was there for a murder that was committed by an unprofessional. That is the theory that makes the most sense to me. Lastly, I wanted to note this to Jaye's mother, who sadly passed away thinking that she had a hand in her daughter's death. I know as parents, we will forever be critical of every decision we make when it comes to the health and safety of our children. But to Lorene and Lorene's family, if you're hearing this, this was not your fault. My opinion may not matter much, but I look at this case and I see no way Lorene's conversation that morning with that caller played a hand in her death. This person was a horrible, obsessed scumbag who was bent on getting what he wanted. I don't think anything was going to change that. I'm sorry for your loss, and I'm sorry her case is still unsolved. Jaye's case is still considered an active case. Anyone with information regarding this case is asked to contact the Brunswick County Sheriff's Office at area code 910-253-2777 or 1-800-672-6379. That's all for today, guys. Sorry for the fumbling and the mouth vomit. I couldn't talk today, but until next time, stay safe.